I wonder how many people clicked on this video with a massive backlog of unpainted grey models sitting impatiently waiting for attention. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40K and a few ideas for expanding armies for each faction in the game. I feel like over the years one question that tends to come back over and over again is what I should get next for my own particular force or faction. It's one of the more common questions asked by newbies on social media, particularly maybe people who have got the general idea of their faction but don't really know all the subtleties of it yet. General online wisdom would usually say that the real answer is whatever you like and find cool and compelling models wise, which absolutely definitely has a lot of value. Meta units and certain gameplay things can often fall by the wayside from codex or edition change, but actual core models that you've done a nice paint job of and you really like the lore of, they'll stick around for good. But sometimes I do feel like that might not be the most directly helpful advice for newer players overwhelmed by choices, maybe seeking a little bit of direction. In general though, it might not be the easiest question to answer really. It really does depend on what your army is and what you're building it up with mind to do. Do you want a balanced force that reflects the lore? What sort of things do you already have in your army at the moment? And even if we are focusing on gameplay, what sort of detachment might you want to play with that army? And what's your own personal playstyle? I thought for this one it could be interesting to try and have just a very quick go at answering that question, or at least for a few ideas for each faction in Warhammer 40k currently. They'll certainly treat this as ideas as opposed to anything like a hard and fast rule. This video is definitely going to be a bit rough and ready. I'm going to try and imagine that people might be in a state where they've got something like 500 to 1000 points worth of an army together, maybe from some initial value box sets or some commonly played units, and then maybe thinking that the eventual idea of the army is to grow it to a bigger size, maybe get it to 2 to 3000 points or so, maybe with a fairly good balance of units for the faction. I aim just to mention a few units somewhere between core units for the faction that have historically generally made sense to having good numbers, some currently useful and strong units in game, and maybe a few things that might be helpful for building up a force in terms of points per dollar from time to time. Certainly pretty handy when you're trying to build an army of any given size to try and get them up to that points value as fast as possible. Obviously a bit of this is going to be stating the obvious, and a lot might not be relevant if you already have those models or you don't like them. I definitely treat this as ideas as opposed to must-buys or whatever. As ever, if you were going to pick up any Warhammer things, I'd bear in mind that there's plenty of places that are cheaper to do so compared with the Games Workshop web store. Online retailers tend to give discounts of anywhere between 10 and 20% around the world, and I do have a few linked in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 20% off, and Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%. Can just be a way to save some money if you were buying things anyway, and if you do choose to use those links down in the video description, it does help support the channel a bit as well. Massive thank you to anyone choosing to use them. Otherwise though, beyond Games Workshop there's definitely lots of other options for expanding the army. And bear in mind the second-hand market such as eBay, often places where you can get really quite good discounts compared with other stuff. Might be a little bit location dependent, maybe a little better in say the UK or USA versus some other places around the world, and quality can be variable. In this day and age as well, there's plenty of 3D printing and third-party alternatives out there, legally distinct things that could potentially be used to stand in for certain Warhammer models. Can be a way to save a bit of money, and again isn't usually the hardest thing to do, searching for alternatives easily in Google. And finally, before we start, the joke at the start of the video wasn't really that much of a joke. I somehow suspect that the majority of the people listening could probably find a new unit that they just happen to have in storage and not painted yet, so it might well be the easiest way to get your hands on something new if you've already bought it and just not got round to finishing it yet. In any case though, let's jump into the video properly and start out with the Space Marines. They've got a really big army range and not really the easiest army to generalise. It's easy to collect armies that are very different to each other, particularly for different chapters and detachments that they have layered upon each other. Maybe one thing that I've tended to notice in the past are that things like combat patrols and discount box sets often leave you with a slight overabundance of various guys with bolters or anti-infantry type weapons. Maybe a little bit of an overemphasis on battle line troops, so it might make sense to expand to a few more damage dealers if you've got a fairly new army. Certainly one that I mentioned in past videos that isn't the worst idea usually are the Primaris Hellblasters. If you're building up a Space Marine army, I think you could usually do a bit worse than going with some of these guys. They're generally quite dangerous damage dealers with general purpose weapons, really easy to use for less experienced players as they'll do good damage against basically everything. They've got really quite good range and mobility, so it's not hard to set that up, and even if the opponent does promptly just target and eliminate them, Then they've got a bit of shoots on death for a consolation prize if you do get them wiped out. They're genuinely looking like they could be a far more competitive unit now they're dropped down to 115 points. You could use some combos with them like Dark Angel's Azrael or Gladius Fire Discipline, and quite a nice one to put in impulsors that you often get in things like combat patrol boxes. To cap it all, if you just want points on the table, they remain one of the single best points per dollar in the Space Marine range. 10 elites with dangerous guns will do that, I guess. Overall, they just feel like quite an easy unit to use and get value out of. For another idea for a unit that I think is rarely going to be a wrong choice are Space Marine Scouts. Currently they're really quite strong in game and have often tended to be historically strong, just being the cheapest version of Space Marines around has its perks. In game right now they're cheap and low investment infiltrators. I feel like the vast majority of Space Marine lists would be pretty good with one or two units of them, starting on midfield objectives as some more expendable trading units, potentially redeploying for secondaries if you'd like. It's not like their damage and defense is particularly terrible for 65 points per 5 anyway. Add all that to a pretty recent and nicely sculpted kit, and that's another perk, at least they're not going to get updated anytime soon. And I feel like the 10 models in the box rather than being sold in groups of 5, again like the Hellblasters, is a positive. You just get far more models for your money than if Games Workshop had packaged them in box sets of 5. Finally, for another one that's been a kind of staple unit of 10th edition is the Gladiator Lancer. This just remains very good at what it does, a strong option if you just want to have something dedicated to smashing enemy vehicles at long range. Just an all-round efficient damage dealer that doesn't need to get close to the enemy and can hover in the backfield, and it's not reliant on Oath of Moment either, so it feels like it can operate really quite independently of the rest of your army. In general, I feel like the Space Marine armor is a lot more balanced than it used to be at the start of the edition, though these things are still kind of fine, I think. This could be one to consider if your own army is generally tending to struggle with big, heavy, tough things. It is quite a focused solution to those. Given that gladiator tanks are quite expensive, I'd certainly magnetize if you're able to sub out the different loadouts when you want to. Compared with the other two, I'd maybe consider it perhaps a little bit more of the flavour of the month type unit. Certainly in 9th edition, it really wasn't all that great. It's maybe not one I'd consider super guaranteed for the long term, perhaps. Moving on to the Guard, the Astra Militarum are another army with a really big range. They do have plenty of distinct army themes. You could go for more horde builds, mechanized guard, artillery heavy lists, or things like mechanized. Different collectors going for different regiments as well might also complicate matters a little bit. Building can be a quite slow and expensive process. I personally recommend either some third party or second hand infantry models to maybe fill out the rank and file a little bit. It is really quite nice to be able to have access to quite a lot of different options there. As a guard player myself, the single best recommendation that I would make is to magnetize up some Lehman Russes. I know not everyone's into their magnetizing, though I feel like it is something that anyone can basically learn how to do. There's loads of good tutorials on YouTube, and you can order any magnets that you need via eBay or Amazon, and there are some dedicated sellers aimed at wargames as well. Just speaking from experience, they're some of the models that I've used the most over the years. Just being able to swap out different weapons for the various different turret options is really handy. And it's even easier to do this now that they all come in one kit rather than being arbitrarily separated between the Demolisher and the battle tank frames. The main gun's perhaps the big one. The sponsons and the front mounted things can fairly easily slot in and out, although I personally chose to oversolve that problem with yet more magnets. I felt like 3 of them was really quite a good number. Able to get as many Russes as I wanted for balanced forces for a while, though I did later choose to expand to 6 of them. They generally tend to be strong for the Imperial Guard as they're one of the focal units that everyone wants to see be at least alright, and Games Workshop do tend to adjust them with balance patches when they do get bad. Perhaps for a more current meta choice, this one might not be the most interesting answer, but in general if you want to make an Astra Militarum or Imperial Guard army stronger, Lord Solar the Ontus is basically auto-include at the moment. I'm sure that's no surprise to most though. Getting a free command point each turn is massive, and godly orders that can affect things like Auxilia and Super Heavies, and even be broadcast a long way by comboing him with a platoon command squad. Not everyone's the biggest fan of the specific Lord Solar mini. I feel like he maybe fits the theme of some regiments and armies far better than he does others. I certainly take the time to take a look at some conversions or alternative models. Again, really easy to do just via Google. I've seen some really cool examples of people make some different stuff to represent him. I particularly enjoy a few of them where he got converted as Yarrick. They looked very nice. Otherwise, perhaps for a nice option to have if you don't have any of them and you want some small numbers are the Tempestus Scions. Again, just historically they tend to be a kind of useful peripheral unit for the guard to have, dropping in to do objectives and things for minimum investment, able to be fielded in small squads of 5. and that does look like that might be even more the case than it has been previously. They're just 50 points per unit of 5 of them, and do bring a bit of genuine threat with a plasma gun and melter gun perhaps, and even can threaten a tiny bit of charge damage with a power fist on the sergeant. Probably don't want to go too heavy on them for the more nuisance and secondary objective type role. Though I feel like also if you wanted to, building a big block of them around a command squad with all the buffs that you can put on them is actually surprisingly deadly right now. It's really quite a cheap unit that you get a ton of special weapons on with some massive rerolls stacked with orders. Moving on to the Sisters of Battle, perhaps one of the more auto-include units right now are more than Val and the Paragon suits, so talking non-dams first I guess. As they go, they are one of the slightly better points per dollar units of the Sisters, which often tend to be pretty expensive on that sort of ratio, being quite big and scary fighting elites. Currently they seem to be one of the most common tournament staple units, with more than Val leading them, having a whole bunch of multi-melters with enormous rerolls, some pretty big hitting melee, and being really quite a nice unit to target with any other buffs and stratagems that you can get, and multi-melters are always nice with miracle dice of course. Depending on the opponent, you could either start on the board or think about taking them off the board, maybe even using rapid ingress if you get the opportunity to. I generally aim to equip multi-melters on the suit, I feel like that's the most powerful of the weapons. Next up, and helping out with the objectives are the Seraphim. They're excellent move shoot move sisters with bolt pistols. Like several other units in the game, they can drop in, fire off the pistols, and then move after, meaning that they can move to unusual areas of the board and pick up points as needed, and again they tend to be a massive tournament staple due to their mobility. I'd be most tempted to run with them with hand flamers at the moment to make them just extra nasty at skirmishing with lighter infantry, which they can do quite well. Plus, just in general, I really quite like the models for these girls. Power armored winged avenging angels are always cool. Finally, for a bit of holy fire support, it's probably old news at this point to plenty of people, but castigators really do fill that role quite well. Just nice efficient firepower. I'd be most tempted by the battle cannon for the ignore cover, given how easy it is to get vehicles in cover at the moment. It just feels like it provides a nice counterpoint to all the melter shots that you can get in the army. Much longer range between the battle cannon and the heavy bolters, and a bit more spam lowish AP versus pinpoint high AP. Easy enough to have one or two of these hovering in the backfield somewhere. I guess perhaps the main downside of these is that they perhaps don't feel quite as sisters as a few of the other units, kind of new kids on the block, and maybe not quite as cool crazy styling as things like the Exorcist or Immolator. I think a lot of sisters players will probably consider it more of an expansion unit to build to as opposed to a core unit that immediately go out and pick up. For the cogboys of the Adeptus Mechanicus, bear in mind that they have some sort of major rules update coming in the next balanced data slate, hopefully going to fix some of the issues that their codex gave them. As a result, I'd probably likely build up slowly and steadily and go fairly balanced rather than say skewing into 30 Taraxi or something that I have seen some tournament lists running around with. Hopefully Games Workshop managed to add some good interest to the army with the next update though. In the meantime, perhaps one contingent to fall out could be a bunch of Vanguard or Rangers in the Dune Riders. They're just really quite efficient units to take the midfield. I previously would have been saying predominantly Vanguard before, but now the Rangers are the same points cost. I feel like there's far better choice between the two. The overall offering is generally quite tanky and annoying to take down, having to pop the transport, and the squad could get out awkwardly inside, or you could have them disembark and actually deal some fairly serious damage with reroll wound rolls. Cork troops are just handy to have for buffing all the other units as well. And at least a fair few lists go really quite heavy on these, lots of small 10-man squads with plenty of transports, so it could be one to double up on maybe. Otherwise, one unit that seems to have been just kind of consistently weirdly strong for a long time are the Iron Striders and Sidonian Dragoons, though I feel like they might not be the most popular kit with AdMech players as a result, often perhaps stealing the limelight from some of the other areas of the Codex or Index. I'd be most tempted by the Las Cannon Iron Strider and the Taser Lance Dragoons, both of them very expendable, cheap and tough skirmish walkers, if anything a little bit depressingly undercosted. I pinched up a few of these a while back. I chose to magnetize so I was able to field them as either variant, as I certainly didn't feel like buying or painting up any more. I personally wouldn't go too heavy into them though. I know some kind of dumb theorycraft list could be putting a ridiculous amount of these on the tabletop, and it might not even be the worst idea in the world. I personally not get loads though, maybe just have somewhere like 1 to 3 as supporting units if you have none. They are some of the epitome of AdMech bad points per dollar. Otherwise, for the unit that maybe isn't enormously great right now, though did have a recent points buff, there's the Castellan robots. I say after the points cut, they do seem at least kind of interesting now, though the reason I'm talking about them isn't due to their current unit strength, It's just literally because they're pretty much the best points per dollar that you can get in the AdMech Codex, so if you want to build an army of any particular size, the chunky robots could well be the way to go. They're somewhere between 2 and 3 points per dollar right now, which is better than anything else for AdMech, and who knows, Games Workshop might actually manage to make them genuinely some of the better damage dealers again, at some point in the future. I personally currently aim to use at least one Power Fist per bot. Some people like Paired Fists, but they definitely have a bit more raw threat in melee as opposed to their shooty damage right now. Next up for the Golden Boys, the Adeptus Custodes had a pretty underwhelming codex launch, though it does mean that they might get rules or points adjustments at some point in the future, so gameplay things might well change if they do really shake out as significantly underpowered. In the meantime, for Custodes collectors though, they can have the consolation prize of them being now by far being the cheapest faction to collect in Warhammer 40K. Their Combat Patrol in 10th edition basically kind of defied all expectations. Games Workshop had gone through making basically all of them worse, but this one was really quite nicely received. 5 Custodian Guard, 5 Wardens, 3 Terminators and a Blade Champion is the majority of their core plastic kits in one offering, or at around about a 30% discount, and all of these are just very strong in game at the moment. You could easily buy 2 or maybe even 3 of these and get away with it, and basically fill that as the majority of your army. Otherwise, if you don't have any Sisters of Silence yet, they could be a pretty reasonable one to expand to at the moment, though I guess at least a fair few people might have some already from the previous Combat Patrol. Just in general, they are going to add overall strength to army lists in at least a few squads of them, given that it means that you can have some small placeholder units to do things like some grunt work to hold down objectives, or to screen out the enemy, or to be small units to do secondary objectives and things. Certainly if there's no indirect fire, you can hold home field objectives for cheap, and I'd be tempted by some minimum squad size Witch Seekers for Scout and Overwatch, or just the even cheaper Prosecutors, if literally what you want is the unit at the cheapest value possible. Otherwise, for the current Custodes flavour of the month, Kyria Draxus is a pretty good Inquisitor to add to a Custodes force. Even though she went up in cost, I feel like she's fairly godly with Custodian Guard. Hiding them from shooting on a 2+ is pretty big, and then her actual range damage is really quite nasty in herself. 10 shots each, she can use that to fire twice when the Custodian Guard fire twice once per game. And if she can manage to do that when they're standing on an objective marker as well, then she gets to reroll wound rolls as well, just making her into a murderous anti-infantry killing machine with those devastating wounds. Obviously she's not a core Custodes miniature though. When rules get changed around, at some point this combo is going to go away, whether it's a new Custodes Codex or that rumoured Agents of the Imperium book that's supposed to come at some point. I bear in mind that this would only last so long. From golden armor to silver, and again for the Grey Knights, I'd go kind of similar and lead with the Combat Patrol. It's kind of hard to talk about anything else with this one, given that the Combat Patrol basically is their core range. It's got all 3 of their plastic kits and in a pretty reasonable ratio as well. Again, you certainly could pretty much buy 3 of these and call it a day, and you'd have a Grey Knight army that wouldn't even be bad. For the Red Knights, most people are using heavy incinerators and Psy Cannons and the Greatsword. Most of the power armoured variants are usable enough. I'll probably have at least one unit of strike squads for that sticky objectives type rule, and both Terminators and Paladins are usable, both having some draws over the other. I guess the biggest query with Grey Knights is whenever they're going to get a big range update. Seems like it'll probably happen at some point, kind of similar to things like Black Templars. It's kind of hard to know at the moment, given that it could be a really quite long time away. Otherwise though, Caldor Drago I feel like is well worth it in 10th edition at the moment. A scary melee combatant that almost guarantees a charge from Deep Strike if you use a CP reroll with him. Plus it's just really quite fun to have the Commander-in-Chief in general, and as he goes monetarily, he's really quite a cheap character to buy in. It's an old Finecast miniature, which I guess brings down the price versus the newer plastics. I strongly suspect he'd be almost £10 more if he was released in plastic and new. If you wanted to try and get an upscale Terminator version of him, you could try and kit bash him from a Deathwing Knight. I saw some people trying to make a Drago from the free miniature of the month, though I suppose there'll still be plenty of individual ones going on eBay. Otherwise, the third thing I thought I'd mention in Grey Knight's admittedly kind of small range is Castellan Crow. Feel like he's particularly of note if you didn't already have a copy of him, given that he's pretty much the only Primaris era Grey Knight sculpt so far. Obviously firstborn styling of the armour and everything like that, but at the newer scale. I feel like as Grey Knight miniatures go, he's one of my favourites as well. Really quite a stylish sculpt with that flowing cursed sword. I think he's strong enough in game to hold his own right now as well, leading Purifiers to do a 3-inch deep strike drop and then light up every infantry that you can see, potentially jumping back into the warp with Mists of Deimos. With Purifiers dropping by 10 points, that feels like it might just raise in prominence a little bit, particularly with things like Dread Knights going up a bit. Next up for the Imperial Knights, they're not exactly an army with a huge range available to them. Only 3 main Games Workshop plastic kits, so if you've already got a collection of them of some sort, then you've probably got a fair amount of that already. It's not really the hardest army in the world to be able to field most combinations of knights at 2000 points. I'm going to echo my thoughts on the Guard Rosses on this one in saying that you could do far worse than invest in some fully magnetised Questoris Knights. The Questoris kit comes with a fairly crazy amount of options, and there's just so many different ways that you can field them with the different weapon options plus carapace weapons, and the option to field Canis Rex or not, that if you do take the time to magnetise them up, they're going to be models that are just going to be used in all sorts of different ways over the years. Again, alongside my magnetised Rosses, they are models that I've got a really good amount of value from. Again, I'd aim to search some tutorials on YouTube and follow along with them. You can also consider magnetising the waist with a sturdy magnet to lift them on and off in storage as well. One variant that I myself didn't have until recently were the bits to acquire Canis Rex or Knight Preceptor if you haven't got them already. Most of my knights came from the era before he was released, so I've only recently in 10th edition added him to my army, just picking up the sprue off eBay. Otherwise, again, given not all that many options, out of the Dominus versus Armigers, I'd probably prioritise a good amount of Armigers first. The Armiger Warglaves are basically always going to be good units for the faction. There hasn't been a lot of time in the history of the Imperial Knights where they haven't been really good to have around in good numbers. That's not changed in 10th either. They've got really good anti-tank weapons, nice objective control, and they work well with those rerolls. I'd be tempted to get somewhere around 4 to 6 Armiger Warglaves to be able to field at 2000 points for options, and maybe 2 Helverins. Again, magnetising is kind of nice to be able to swap out between the loadouts if you can take the time. Otherwise, for supporting options for Imperial Knights, they are pretty much the Imperial army that gets the most value out of a few allied agents, given that otherwise your smallest unit is an 140 point Helverin. Even if they were a little bit pricier than they were, then 50 points for 4 Inquisitorial Henchmen or some Voidsmen at Arms is nice. Means that you can use those to do certain things like secondary objectives, or maybe hold a primary for super cheap if the enemy doesn't have any good way of getting to them. And otherwise, the lone operative assassins tend to be really popular, the Calidus assassin maybe being the most obvious, bouncing around the table, doing secondaries, and ruining stratagems. I've seen some people use the Eversaw for some fast scout moving, and a bit more blending enemy infantry in combat. I feel usually around about maybe 1 copy of each of these is generally going to make an Imperial Knight list a bit stronger. It might be a little bit more so than just getting 1 extra armiger for the winning of the overall mission. There's certainly some people just like to keep it 100% on the big knight suits. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got the Divergent Space Marines. I'll go over them each on one slide, I think. All of them do have some overlap with the actual Space Marines mentioned at the start of the video, and maybe do have a bit of overwhelming choice of what to choose from. I'll maybe try and focus on their unique units a bit more so than core codex things. For the Black Templars, their range is very small, simple, and pretty nicely done. They've got 3 unique characters in the Emperor's Champion, Helbrecht, and Grimaldus, and 2 fighty squads with Sword Brethren and Primaris Crusaders. I just generally gradually build up to having all those unique characters, and at least a few copies of each of the fighting troops and elites. All that's perhaps fairly obvious. Maybe in support I might consider something like a Land Raider Redeemer to deliver something like Helbrecht plus Sword Brethren into battle. Really quite a good unit for Space Marines at the moment, with long range melee delivery nearly guaranteed, plus a massive overwatch threat with those Flamestorm cannons. You could always go fluffy and play the Crusader though, of course. For Blood Angels, unlike the Black Templars, they haven't had their Primaris range refresh yet, and I feel like that does in the interim lessen the value of all the cool stuff that they otherwise have. Might just feel a bit silly to go super heavy on Death Company or Sanguinary Guard if they're going to get them updated sometime in 10th, which they definitely could. In the meantime, I'd perhaps think about picking up their actual Primaris characters, Dante and Mephiston, if you wanted some painting projects. I think both of those are really quite nicely done new miniatures and pretty cool characters in the lore. Otherwise, generally, Blood Angels have typically had affinity with Assault Marines. Jump Intercessors are pretty great for Sons of Sanguinius right now. Might not be the worst to get a few generic red armoured jump packs painted up at some stage, even if maybe the main event is going to be the Sanguinary Guard and Death Company releasing whenever they do. You could maybe think about converting a Sanguinary Priest to lead them with a jump pack. For the Dark Angels, it basically feels like they've had their Deathwing release, but are going to get a Ravenwing 1 next edition. Might make a bit more sense to skew a little bit more towards their newer miniatures as a result, as opposed to the Ravenwing things which do have a good chance of going to Legends whenever they get updated. Certainly currently, if you wanted to add raw strength to an army, Azrael is pretty much auto-include if you haven't picked him up yet. Farming command points, protecting his unit with invulnerable saves and sustained hits is just all rather great for 100 points. He pairs particularly excellently with Hellblasters. Otherwise, the new Deathwing Knights feel like they could be a bit more of a force in earnest now they've dropped down to 215 points. Their damage output still isn't super scary, though they certainly will be able to handle most normal-sized infantry units relatively easily. At 215 points, I think they are back to the point where they're genuinely very tanky for the cost. 4 wounds apiece and -1 damage is really quite hefty to get through. Otherwise, maybe if there's one unit to single out, it might be the Landspeeder Darkshroud from the Ravenwing side of things. This is really quite solid in the Ironstorm Spearhead at the moment, and it maybe isn't the most huge investment in the world given that it's just one model. Having one of these to cloak some nearby Dreadnoughts or even a Storm Raven can make them unusually durable, and can make the Dark Angels version of that formation extra good. The Space Wolves, like the Blood Angels, are waiting on their range refresh. Maybe for units to focus on in the meantime, the Thunder Wolves are a really key unit right now. There's certainly been a fair few Space Wolf players around there building up towards a very Thunderwolf heavy force to run in Stormlance Task Force. They're just a big, tough and scary unit with some good synergies and some really quite powerful leader options too. Wolf Riders are kind of cool and fun in my opinion. Plus, I'd say that they're maybe just a tiny bit likelier than some to escape a Primaris update directly. Feels like they could be one of the ones that are left till later until they've done maybe a few more of the more normal Space Wolf units. Otherwise, adding in some cheap Fenrisian Wolves for a nice 30-point little skirmish unit is generally not the worst. They move fast, and while they can't hold primary objectives, they're good for secondary objectives. Most Space Marine armies don't have access to 30-point models that move fast, and plenty of chapters would get these if they could. Otherwise, as with the Blood Angels, might be worth focusing one of the few Primaris updates to the Space Wolves in Ragnar Blackmane. A pretty fun sculpt in the Space Wolf that's decapitated Ghazghkull once. Could be one to consider if you want him in your army. He does have really quite a serious amount of good AP damage to melee attacks on the charge. Can be an excessive amount of those with Blade Guard. Finally, for the Divergent chapters, the Deathwatch are currently in a bit of a concerning space. They haven't really had all that much support or attention from Games Workshop in a while, including being completely passed over in the last balance update, despite looking like they're one of the weaker armies in the game. It is causing quite a few people to speculate whether or not they're going to properly support them in 10th edition or roll them into some sort of Imperial Agents book. That is speculation at the moment, though. I'd certainly be a bit concerned for some of their kill team types. Even if the 10th edition codex does come, Games Workshop have a bit of a history of removing units that don't have a clear box set to buy them with, and a lot of the Deathwatch units would fall into that. Otherwise though, if you are collecting them in the meantime, probably the Veterans kit is the one to focus most on. It is the coolest kit for the Deathwatch anyway, given that it gets loads of fun gear, and you've got lots of options for different squad customization. Going heavy on the frag cannons and the heavy thunder hammers usually makes sense at the moment. Otherwise, probably the Watchmaster is one of the more interesting of the HQs, could bear enhancements like that Tome of Ectoclades, and one of their other more potent options are the triple Terminators with Cyclone missile launchers within either a Proteus kill team or a Terminator unit, though it does seem a bit unlikely to me to survive a rules update. Moving on to the forces of the Dark Gods, and first up we have the Chaos Space Marines. They're currently awaiting their Codex update, which should be at least fairly soon. Maybe another chapter that's going to be really quite variable depending on the legional theme that you're going for as to what sort of units you're going to look at, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens with their detachments and what they might encourage. In the meantime, in the points update before the Codex though, the Chaos Vindicator at least looks interesting at 175 points. It's just got fearsome all-round anti-tank and anti-elite damage dealing at that kind of cost when you give it a Nurgle mark for all the sustained hits in the world. Feels like one or more of these is really going to be a bad choice, particularly with a 2+ save that can easily get cover. There's absolutely no telling whether it's still going to be good in the Codex or not, of course, but it doesn't seem like the worst excuse to add one to your army if you had had your eye on the siege tank for a while and wanted an excuse. I probably wouldn't go rushing out to get 3 of them though, far better to wait for the Codex before pulling the trigger on that kind of thing. Otherwise, since the points update, depending on how many legionaries you have in your army, it genuinely might not be the worst idea to expand the ranks here a little bit, or at least think about trying to equip them with a more optimal loadout, generally a power fist plus heavy melee weapon in the unit, and then either a heavy or special weapon. With the last points update, they went down to 80 points per unit of 5 of them, which is kind of crazy for what they can do. They're durable enough, Space Marine troops with objective control too, and they just have loads of damage with those various special weapons, getting reroll wounds versus enemies on objectives, and then dark packs for nasty damage buffs beyond that. They're certainly a unit that can threaten to drag down something that's far above their weight. I'd be tempted to have some rhinos to cover them, to deliver them into the midfield with some speed and safety. Otherwise, it does look like there's some interesting enough discount deals coming for the Chaos Space Marines on the way. There's a big Dread Talons box set that's focused on Raptors and Cultists, a Veterans of the Long War one that focuses on the core choices, and a new Combat Patrol with some Possessed and Cultists in it. Presuming that you can actually pick these up and Games Workshop don't massively underproduce, as often seems to be their way. All of these do look like pretty good deals as far as Warhammer goes. The Veterans box set maybe being a bit more of a core one that could be great for newer players, Dread Talons maybe being a bit more appealing as a sort of expansion type force for more established collectors. For the World Eaters, at the moment they've got really quite a small range of unique stuff. Maybe the sensible answer might be to save and wait until whatever happens with the Codex in 10th edition, where it seems likely they'll get a bunch more units. So maybe if you're getting more stuff in 10th edition and you've already got a fairly established collection, it might be worth waiting to see the options. For a core of the army, I'd be tempted to get something like Angron, 1 combat patrol, maybe 2 or 3 units of 8 bound and Khan, maybe some rhinos to transport the Khorne Berserkers into battle. Otherwise, though, in the meantime, from expanding from something like that, maybe you could consider getting another one of the Combat Patrol box sets. I'd guess it'll likely get changed up somehow in 10th edition, so it might have some slightly different units on offer. Multiple copies of the Juggernaut Lord can be alright, as you can build one as Lord Invocatus. It does mean that you might be going a bit weirdly heavy on the Khorne Berserkers, though. Feels like by the time you might have 40 of the things, you might have gone a bit crazy with the trim highlighting, and you might have slightly diminishing returns there. They are looking pretty interesting currently though, now their points dropped down to 90 points, so it might be kind of fun for a bit after this balance update. Otherwise, as mentioned, getting some rhinos to get those berserkers where they need to be is generally a good idea. Even at 90 points, I wouldn't class them as standout durable or anything like that. I think you're better off going to be going with the transport as a battlefield bunker that they can charge out of. Handy enough to have around while they're scrapping over the midfield objectives. Otherwise, maybe if you wanted a really big centerpiece model, you could consider a Lord of Skulls. Currently they're at least fairly effective, with some great big shooting weapons, and a suitably destructive melee profile. They can be a unit that could be really hard to take down as well if they're struggling to deal with Angron flapping up in their faces. In general though, I would say that Titanic models in 40k tend to have a bit of a questionable track record staying relevant. They often tend to maybe get good every so often, but for the most part tend to be pretty niche. For the Death Guard, it seems nice enough to start by mentioning Typhus. The name Lord of the Death Guard is pretty much in auto-include territory right now for a unit to add to an army. 80 points for his mortal wound attack is pretty great, never mind the fact that it's attached to a character that's both tough and melee dangerous. It's pretty much good wherever you run him, whether it's with lots of Poxwalkers, Death Shroud, or even solo. He does crop up in the Combat Patrol box, which I think maybe isn't the most popular of the Combat Patrol boxes out there, as it is dependent on you wanting 30 of the Poxwalkers. Though if you don't have any Poxwalkers yet, I don't think it's the most unreasonable purchase. It means that the Horde sort of element of the army is well and truly covered with that box set, and hopefully they'll reinterpret the Combat Patrol for 10th edition in a more helpful way with less focus on the chaff. Otherwise, sticking with men with scythes, more Death Shroud aren't the worst idea at the moment. They often tend to be the fighting elite and some of the best damage dealers of the Index or Codex. You could easily justify running 3 units of 3 in a 2000 point army at the moment if you want, plus I think they're just generally quite cool models. They do feel very Death Guard with great big Terminators with scythes. They're nice enough to deep strike or rapid ingress into close combat, and they've got good support beyond Typhus with the various Lords and Sorcerer. Otherwise, for a third idea to support the Plague Marines, the Biologist Putrefier is a bit of a go-to for a bunch of mortal wounds and threat right now. Plague Marines in Rhinos fighting in the mid-board often tend to crop up in Death Guard lists, and this guy's usually one of the options to lead them. His free grenade stratagem means that you can really punch out a whole load of mortal wounds focally on one enemy unit. Then he can attack with the Hyper Blight grenades on top of that, and also the unit's own shooting attacks with their boosted lethal hits that he gives. I feel like his model is far enough, and he does also come in the Combat Patrol alongside Typhus. Might be the sort of model that you could kit bash though with some suitable grenade parts. For the Thousand Sons, again their range is pretty small, somewhat similar to the World Eaters. I feel like if you're building up to a central force of Thousand Sons, maybe something like Magnus, Araman, a bunch of sorcerers, and perhaps 20 or more rubrics and 10 scarabs could be a first port of call to aim for a fairly rounded force. Certainly the Rubric Marines, Scarabs and Exalted Sorcerer kits are all really good points per money for regular 40k standards, which maybe makes them a bit more worth prioritising if you want to get a Legion of Rubrics on the table for a bit cheaper. Generally building up to this sort of look would be my first sort of thought for a Thousand Sons army that's fairly resilient to rules changes. Otherwise, to add on to that, maybe some cultists could be particularly good at the moment. They've often been run as just cheap supporting units in competitive lists, and look to get better at that now given that they had a recent points cut. 55 points is pretty good for what they bring, I think. They get a scout move, a 6+ invulnerable save, and if they do actually manage to put the finishing blow on anything, then they have the chance to gain a CP, which is pretty big. In general, just nice to have some units that cost far less than your standard rubrics though, to do things like objective camping, screening, and secondaries. Otherwise, another nice add-on could be a Mutalith Vortex Beast. I think some people tend to be a bit more for or against it though, given it's fairly far removed from your more standard Rubric Space Marine kind of aesthetic. It's not too bad to have one in the centre of a force though, quite nice to be able to threaten double range on Kabbalistic rituals, which could lead you to throwing out some surprise long-range Doom Bolts. Having the threat of a really high damage Warp Lance shot out of that big portal on the back really means that enemy heavies can't really relax around it either, and it will at least soak up a fair bit of firepower with the lots of wounds and feel no pain. Moving on to the demons, in general they're going to vary quite a lot depending on which deity you're playing, so I might just focus on a few units that are currently effective in game at time of recording. At 230 points the Great Unclean One does feel fairly standout for that value, and then spend the extra 30 on him to get the 4+ feel no pain, meaning that you've just got a spectacularly bulky unit for 260 points to waddle up onto one of the middle sections of the board and take all the damage the opponent can throw at him while dishing out a bit of his own. Generally feels like quite a solid choice. I'd be tempted to give him a Bile Sword and the Flail and just walk up to the near objectives and cause problems. Otherwise, Flamers of Tzeentch I feel like are quite often a relevant unit for the Chaos Demons. They're one of the few true range damage dealers there, and that often tends to have good synergy with their Deep Strike shenanigans. In 10th edition that isn't really any exception. Again, they've been a fairly common competitive unit, and they're quite nice with the possibilities of close range Deep Strike and then shooting, or Overwatch as well. Feels like when you can get their torrent weapons on enemy infantry in unexpected places, they're going to do kind of well. Finally, for a third idea, it does seem like it's currently the Blood Crusher's time to shine. Really quite a commonly used sturdy damage dealer for the army right now. They get a lot of their value out of their mortal wound impact hits, and then the Herald leading them and the Remmaster can amp up that damage yet further, maybe being one of the better units to have to charge out of Deep Strike as well if you'd like to. Could be interesting to get them there with Shadow of Chaos, perhaps even with Be'lakor. You do get some in the Combat Patrol as well, which could be helpful if you got that. I do feel like there may be a unit that hasn't been quite so reliably good in the past though. For the Chaos Knights, like the Imperials and a few of the other things we've mentioned, they really don't have all that many kits on offer. Again, for first general idea, I'd just say try and build up towards a fairly well balanced core force that can take the points changes that Games Workshop's likely to throw at it. Maybe something like 2 abhorrents of some sort, and make good use of magnets to be able to swap out between them from game to game. And particularly at the moment it does make sense to go fairly heavy on War Dogs. Maybe 6 to 8 of them could be a full starter force. If you really wanted to go for current competitive builds, then you could go all the way up to 12 or so. Depends on whether or not you really want to focus that all the way out to an option. I have a feeling that eventually Games Workshop is going to find a way to not make them the best thing for the entire army though. Otherwise could maybe add in a Knight Tyrant or Despoiler. Potentially the Despoiler could be an option that you could just try and acquire some of the weapons and magnetize them up to add on to the more Abhorrent class Knights built from the Abominant kit. Might not be one that you need to actually get an entire another Knight to be able to field. Otherwise though, expanding from that more sort of balanced core, the Sevastus Knight Lancer is really quite a fun one at the moment. I do quite like the new model for this thing, big tall knights and no longer paying quite as extortionate prices in Forge World resin for them. It moves fast and hits very hard in melee with Tank Shock and that big lance, and it does seem to be at least fairly common in competitive lists, usually alongside mass War Dogs at the moment. It can be a nice target for the whole Chaos Knights phase through walls thing, which can help it get to its prey. Otherwise, as with the Imperials, Chaos Knights can really profit from some allied demons of some sort. Generally, Nurglings tend to be the first go-to here. They can infiltrate and hold down the mid-board early. They won't be able to do primary objectives, but can do secondaries, and also have the big help of debuffing the enemy as well with -1 to hit. Beyond them, Beasts of Nurgle tend to be at least somewhat popular too, sometimes some of the Tzeentch lone operatives perhaps. I would bear in mind though that when getting demon allies, these are eventually likely to change in the long run. These more peripheral, out of codex options can often tend to cycle around between what's actually useful or whether you can even field them at all. Moving on to the Xenos, and for the Aeldari we have the Avatar of Cain, a big cool and recent centerpiece model for the Aeldari God of War. In general at the moment it's a hard model to go too far wrong with, really quite tough and can take a beating, which is helpful for Eldar given that they don't have that many units that can just afford to hold objectives and things with raw might. He can be a massively serious threat on Overwatch as well if the enemy moves up with him and then he auto hits with that sustained hits Wailing Doom. Having a Farseer on hands to throw the Fate Dice at him there can be big. Otherwise, as well as just having quite a fun model, while he is expensive, at least he has a fairly good points per dollar ratio at around about 3. That's better than the majority of Eldari kits. Despite some very big points increases, the Autarch Wayleaper still seems to be a fairly common competitive staple. The extra command points can be really nice for Eldari, they do have some fun stratagems, and then beyond that he's just a very fast moving lone operative with access to fights first with a Banshee mask. It can be a nice nuisance thing to have winging around in the later game, potentially doing secondaries or even genuinely threatening small squads of enemy elites. The Phoenix Gem did recently increase in cost, but it can be quite a nice enhancement to resurrect him from death. That's particularly powerful on a lone operative as he might not be able to shoot or engage him very easily, so him standing up on death and just running away after that could be very annoying. Otherwise, maybe for some optimal anti-tank firepower, the War Walkers often tend to be the go-to choice for that at the moment. Perhaps one of the best all-round anti-tank gun platforms in the army. 2 Bright Lances plus Battle Horse rerolls generally equals some very dead tanks at long range, and the defense isn't awful for a light vehicle, getting a good invulnerable save and -1 to wound against range built in. You definitely need to play kind of careful with them in terms of what they get exposed to, but can be a really menacing threat to have in the backfield. For the Dark Eldar, the next Drukhari kit to release is the Mandrakes, and I feel like that should be at least a fairly interesting one for Drukhari collectors. They do look like they're just all around a fairly generally good pickup here. They're the newest models to the faction with some really quite fun and sinister sculpts. They're a bit better value than if they'd been packaged in a box of 5 like the Racks were. That's definitely going to mean that they're a little bit better points per model versus units like them, which is nice. And then just in general, they seem to be pretty well auto-include in most competitive Drukhari lists right now. Cheap infiltrate units are nice in themselves, never mind the fact that they can basically fade away and return to the boards to do secondary objectives and things, and bully enemy lighter infantry with their balefire and their glimmering blades. Otherwise, if you want some amped up Dark Lance firepower, another unit that's currently considered at least fairly auto-include are the Scourges. Typically they tend to get fielded with maximum Dark Lances right now, able to fly around on their back wings, pop off shots at the enemy, and then hide behind terrain. If the enemy doesn't have some either extreme fast movers, some indirect firepower, or good things that can overwatch at long range, then they're probably not going to be able to engage them at all, and it's very intimidating to have lance firepower coming at you every single turn that you can't do anything about. Later in the game, they can put that fairly godly speed to good use to do any objectives that they need to, if they suddenly need to rush the enemy as opposed to staying safe. Finally, for the Drukhari, it's probably worth mentioning the Combat Patrol as well. I'm sure lots of people might well have started their collection with this as just a really good general purpose box for the force, but compared with at least a fair few of the others, could well be one that's alright to double up on. Particularly at present in the Sky Splinter formation, pretty well everything is really good here. Cabalites are nice for objectives, Incubi and Archon can charge really far and are nice and blendy, Ravagers have good fire support, and Raiders are generally needed to get the assault troops where they need to be. I can't help but think that just about any redesign of the Drukhari Combat Patrol is probably going to make it overall worse, so it might not be the worst to prioritise, at least compared with some of the other options in the range. Next up for the leagues of Votann, at the moment they really don't have a huge range, they sort of just launched in 9th edition and it feels like they've got quite a lot more kits to come, so again if you've got a fair core of the army established already, it might well be worth saving the hobby budget for when more stuff comes out. Otherwise, I guess the next release we know about are the Hernkin Jaegers. I guess they're one unit that we know that no one has yet in their collection, unless you've got creative with proxy models in the interim. They'll certainly get a 40k datasheet at some point. I strongly suspect being the infiltrate option for the faction, maybe a unit that can start in the mid-board early and hold down some victory points with their shotguns and trench coats. Otherwise, though, for the core of the army, I feel like if you don't already have a unit of 10 Einhir Hearthguard with a character leading them, that could be a pretty reasonable one to tech up to in the meantime. They generally tend to be one of the main damage hammers for the Leagues of Votann army, often deep striking, and then just letting rip with a whole load of +1 to hit and wound Vulcanite shots with lots of mortal wounds and maybe sustained hits thrown in for good measure. If they can double down with a charge after that, so much the better, but it's just really quite a big powerful unit to use your best stratagems on. Otherwise, perhaps the other element of the army that people might expand to a little bit later, after combat patrols and things, might be the vehicle support for the army. Perhaps if you want a fairly well-rounded Votann force, could be worth building up to something like 3 Sagitaurs and a couple of land fortresses. Some people absolutely do run absolutely mass Sagitaurs at tournaments and things, though I feel like going all the way to 6 of them does feel perhaps a bit excessive and could leave you a bit vulnerable to if the datasheet gets nerfed heavily. I'd probably be most tempted by the high las beam weapons on the Sagitaurs currently, perhaps the missiles being another good alternative. And since the points updates, genuinely Hearthkin Warriors seem like a pretty nice thing to fill them with now. Berserks and Grimnirs can also work too, though. For the Orks, the new codex really means that there's going to be a lot of variation depending on detachment. Dread mobs are very different to Green Tides and Bully Boys, though I feel like just about every army out there would get good value from some Gretchen. I tend to really like quite cheap small units just for nuisance and interfering type things, and Gretchen just seem absolutely excellent value for 40 points. 11 models on the board and often going to be more than most squads can kill in one round of shooting, just literally with sheer numbers as they're not getting saves or anything a lot of the time, but they have good objective control, no worse leadership than most other things, and they just generate you command points while they're sat there. Meaning one unit I'd say is absolutely 100% auto-include for home field objectives. I don't think it's a bad idea to have another squad heading towards the midfield. The kit itself is very cheap as Games Workshop goes, though obviously the miniatures are really tiny and simplistic. I do think they're fun though. I feel like Gretchen had a bit of fun factor to the Orc army. I certainly enjoyed painting them up myself. Otherwise, it looks like one of the units that a lot of people are looking to add to the army at the moment is Mega Knobs. They very much feel like the current flavour of the month unit for Orcs, lots of people just being rather enamoured by their 4+ feel no pain that they get in the War for their 30 points, and maybe doubly so in Bully Boys given that you get 2 turns of War there. Feels like they've got some really interesting options in other detachments though, whether it's the faster than used assault ramp type thing for the Cult of Speed, or being led by mechs in Dread Mob. I would say that the kit's really quite a pricey one though, and you don't get much points for the money whatsoever. There is at least some chance that if they are really as good as people think they are, they might well go up in points at some point, so I'd certainly bear that in mind before going in super hard on these. Otherwise, for the Orcs, a lot of the rank and file can be kind of expensive in terms of points per the money, generally due to Orcs just not being particularly elite. For getting the most points on the board for the least money, perhaps some of the best bets are the Stomper and Ghazghkull Thraka. The Stomper's recently been in that Stomper Boys battle force, and that's mysteriously coincided with Games Workshop giving it somewhat usable rules, even if it did keep its very high points cost of 800. I feel like between narrow profiles of terrain and the odd army that you're facing having just enough anti-tank to delete it fairly comfortably, it's still really going to have its limitations, but in Dread Mob you absolutely can make this thing shoot hard enough to justify those 800 points, I think. Comboing stratagems and a mech and all those detachment rules can make it utterly nasty, never mind anything you can catch in combat with that crazy mega chopper. It's also perhaps one of the best deals in terms of plastic for the money from Games Workshop. It is kind of weird that it towers over Imperial Knights, but costs a bit less than them. Otherwise, on the points for somewhat cheap, Ghazghkull Thraka is a bit over 3 points per dollar. I do really quite like the miniature for him, and he got buffed in game recently, plus Mega Knobs getting better certainly helps him out as well. Overall, just feels like he's got a lot more relevance, and he rarely tends to be too awful in game. He's certainly a unit that people want to see big and threatening and scary. For the Necrons, they've been very strong over the last few months or so, and looks like they're set to remain so, even if they have taken a few nerfs in their latest points update. Perhaps low-key, one of the more interesting things out of that was the death marks getting yet cheaper, a unit that I thought was perfectly usable already, but now dropping down from 13 points to 12 points each. I feel like just their raw stat line is fairly impressive for that, Toughness 5, a 3+ save, and reanimating entire models with each wound restored is all quite nice, and getting a Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2 shots at good range for the cost also seems fine. On top of that, they're really quite a cheap unit to drop in to do secondary objectives and things, though occasionally you might actually be able to get some use out of their ambush type rule, or try and get some pinpoint damage on a particularly fragile character. They're quite nice in Hypercrypt as well, with their repeated unrestricted deep striking anywhere they want to be on the board. Catan remain very scary, and it still seems that the Nightbringer and Deceiver models aren't getting an update anytime particularly soon, and given that it looks like they're still hanging on to small, relatively cheaper models as it goes for Games Workshop, they are some of the best points per dollar in the Necron army, if you're trying to build up towards a 2,000 point list or something. Despite some points increases for the Katana, I'd rate both of these are still pretty standout for the army overall, spectacularly hard to take down. The Nightbringer's extra dangerous, though costs more, the Deceiver a little bit less so, but tougher with stealth and cheap. Even if you don't like the older models, there's a pretty good scope for converting Katana as well. They're basically elemental eldritch deities of one sort or another, so there's plenty of scope for making your own versions of them, either for these guys or for the Transcendent Catan. Otherwise, beyond frontline units like Immortals or Wraiths and things, it's good to have them backed up by some fairly solid fire support choices, of which the Necrons have plenty. I feel like it usually makes sense to have at least some heavy guns at the back that can take out enemy heavies at range. Perhaps the three biggest options I'd consider most for that would be the Canoptek Doomstalker, really strong against heavy infantry in particular, and good in the Canoptek Court. Locust heavy destroyers with the massive scary damage 6 Gauss weapons. They might like Hypercrypts just a little bit more, given that they can hop around the board gaining lines of sight. And the Doomsday Art just remains a pretty big investment and slightly random but very serious damage output generalist. A bit more robust with a high wound count and an invulnerable save as well. They still seem to be seeing play in competitive lists. For the greater good, the Tau Empire are currently still waiting their points at time of recording. Obviously that could change what things are most useful in game, though I feel like even if they did go up a bit, stealth suits would remain very relevant, both being a godly guiding unit and a nice infiltrate unit all packaged in one. It's quite nice that there's a guide buffing unit that's within the codex, so players aren't kind of hamstrung if they don't take Forge World Tetras. They're often going to be the best choice for guiding the majority of big scary Tau threats now. They do get a marker drone for the ignored cover, and plus have some extra value such as stealth, a little bit of damage output of their own, and the homing beacon for some rapid ingress shenanigans. Seems like a unit that you're going to struggle to go too far wrong with, even if you took multiple of them. Otherwise, for up and coming units that are looking like they're basically auto-include competitively, the new Kroot Carnivores could be worth one squad of. Obviously, they're massively focal if you're trying to build around the Kroot hunting pack, though they're just fairly godly objective support in an otherwise Tau army. If they remain at least somewhat close to their 55 points or so, they're pretty awesome for objective control too at 20 OC for that, plus getting scouts and also getting sticky objectives as well. That's really quite nice to throw on the home field, never mind if you can get it anything going towards the midfield as well. Otherwise, I'm sure plenty of people will be focusing on the big scary guns like broadsides, skyrays, hammerheads, and maybe crisis suits, but I feel like it's particularly helpful for Tau to have something that can fight hard for the midfield objectives. It's often a bit difficult for the Tau for the balance between advancing towards the enemy and not just getting their units tied up in close combat and things. So very important to have some squads that can move forward with a bit more confidence and fight for the midfield early. Breaches and Devilfish can often be the go-to here. They've got good movement, really good OC, and pretty massive damage with rerolls against units on objectives, plus some fun stuff in Montcar and Cowion in terms of stratagem support. They'll certainly do a number on most infantry, and can even threaten to one-round certain lighter battle tanks as well with maximal buffs. Otherwise, Riptides can be quite a nice option to have on the front line. They're very durable for the cost compared with most Tau units, and get to fall back and shoot, which is useful. Means that you can push them up the board with confidence and not have to make difficult decisions whether they fall back or not. Can just be quite nice to get charged, step back from the opponent, shoot them with the Riptide and also everything else in the Tau army. Next up for the Genestealer Cult Uprising. As with a couple of others, it feels like the Combat Patrol box set near enough is the faction at the moment. Again, this is one of the box sets that you could potentially get 3 of if you wanted to get it to a 2,000 point army relatively easily, and pretty much the single kit that turns the faction from being really quite an expensive army to play to a relatively okay one, at least by the standards of Warhammer models. You get both sections of troops and go heavy on the neophytes, which isn't the worst at the moment. Some nice dangerous aberrants, and now the Goliath Truck and Rock Grinder is looking a fair bit more interesting. Dropping 20 points I think was very appropriate for that. Overall it's around about 640 points or so on the board. Definitely one of the better combat patrols out there. And given that we've got a new Genestealer Cult Codex coming out, it's hard to imagine that the replacement for this will be anywhere near as good. It basically feels like it's just got one more unit in here than you'd otherwise expect. I feel like the next one will be a bit more tame. Otherwise, beyond the units in that box, for quite nice support options, the Achilles Ridge Runner is one to mention maybe. Having at least one in the army with a mortar to hand out AP-1 and ignores cover wherever you need it most really is quite a powerful thing. Between this and the stratagems and character buffs, it can really turn neophytes and acolytes from kind of good damage dealers to kind of great ones. Perhaps in the last turns it can then start to put its speed to good use and just be a nuisance unit to tie up and annoy the enemy. Otherwise, if I had to pick one support character that might be alright to prioritise, the Reductus Saboteur seems particularly fun at the moment. A very fragile lone operative if you catch them, but the Saboteur just comes with so many bombs, a free grenade stratagem, remote explosives, a demo charge, and a once per game reactive mortal wound attack that sometimes can make a good portion of her value back when it's used. Given a few fun grenades, explosives, and demo charge bits elsewhere in 40k as well, feels like the sort of model that you could convert without too much difficulty to. If you did want a budget option on the cheap, or even just a different alternative if you wanted to run more than one. Finally, we've got their alien deities in the Tyranids, recipients of a big and fun recent plastic range. I feel like the first thing to mention for them is anything that you could potentially still want in the future from either the Leviathan or the starter set box sets. A lot of the miniatures for these are going perhaps surprisingly dirt cheap for Warhammer standards. Say for example the Psychophage that was in both the starter sets and the Leviathan box sets, that's going for sub £10 in the UK. Often around about a quarter of what Games Workshop might sell certain comparable monsters for. The Neurotyrant on eBay doesn't seem to be going for much more than that either. Can be quite a nice one given that it's such a fun model, and also one that you might well want in more competitive lists too. Generally, if you want cheap Tyranid armies on the board fast, then this is still the way to do it at the moment. Might just be worth embracing a few of these if you do plan to go for Tyranids in the long term, as these will all go away when 11th edition comes around, probably in a bit more than 2 years by Games Workshop's normal timeframes. I imagine a few things from Leviathan might well gradually get a little bit more pricier as time goes on as well, and the supplies of that start to fade away. Otherwise, for the Tyranids, they've got quite a few powerful objective play units that can generally increase the strength of the army overall, even if it's more by scoring than damage. One Biovore is tempting to have, just one unit to throw spore mines out to do secondary objectives, though bear in mind that there's at least a reasonable chance that might change at some time in the future, say if Games Workshop rewrote their mission pack. Otherwise, despite their points increase, gargoyles are still very common in competitive lists. Just having one unit that can drop out of deep strike and then move after shooting can be a good way to snag secondaries or primaries, and against some armies you can threaten to do big annoying first turn move block type things. And finally, basically all their lone operatives are very good compared with what other factions have. Neurolictors can threaten to flip objectives and make enemy units incredibly easy to kill with +1 to wound, and Death Leaper and the regular Lictor are both rather excellent fights first skirmishers too, the regular ones with free rapid ingress. Finally, Tyranids' main problem at the moment tends to be trying to kill big tough heavy things in the enemy's army. They don't really have all that much strong shooting profiles. Currently it seems that the main thinking for those is to try and handle them with mass damage 3 attacks, the Exocrine and the Maliceptor perhaps being the most tempting here. Both of them are just pretty efficient stat lines overall, at least fairly tough for the cost each in their own way, really quite nasty against Terminator equivalents with 3 wounds in particular, and just through weight of fire or maybe invasion fleet for lethal hits, they have the opportunity to punch up a little bit against tough things, particularly if multiple of them focus the same targets. In any case, with the Xenos armies rattled through there, I think that just about brings us to the end of this one. Let me know what you think for your army and what you'd be tempted to expand to next down in the comments below. And I hope perhaps a few of the ideas might have had some sort of inspiration for some of you out there. Old news to plenty of folks, I'm sure though. As mentioned, if you were thinking about picking up any plastic kits in the near future, feel free to check out those links in the video description to save a bit of money versus Games Workshop, and it can help to support the channel if you'd like to. As ever, bear in mind other options like second-hand miniatures or third-party or 3D printed stuff as well. In any case though, hope you've enjoyed the video. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more like this. I'll certainly keep the 40k related content coming. I do tend to post new stuff just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the content coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.